Hi everyone, welcome back to season 5 of the How to Do It video series. Now we're sitting here with a bit of sun in our eyes, but on Dusk, on a beautiful property owned by Shane Gregg. And Shane is really well known, the good operator is what people would call him around the region. And he's also renowned with his multiple skills, including human health skills, but he's sort of appreciated for his wisdom and willingness to share, and he's agreed to have a little chat to us. And part of the focus, it's going to be wide range, and we'll talk about all sorts of things, but part of the focus will be basically how you can be more profitable. I asked Shane some things that he'd like to chat about, and he said, well, how can you be green when you're in the red, as a question that needs to be addressed. So we're going to talk about profitability, and we're going to talk about whatever we feel like talking about, and thanks very much for agreeing to have a chat. So perhaps you could give us a little bit of history of your farming experience to date, and your motivation and your ongoing passion, and what is it that gets you up each day?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I think we were just talking about this before, and we do get tired when we, as you know yourself, you put so much effort into wanting to make a difference in the world.
Yeah.
So my background is basically my parents bought this farm. They had no experience back in the 1950s. They had no experience at all in the land.
Yeah.
And that was a great thing because they questioned everything that was done. This paddock here was most probably covered in trees and very poor because they ran sheep and rabbits was their enterprise, not by choice. But you've seen this whole country change, and I think what's exciting, and we'll maybe talk about this a little bit more later on, but what's important about the history is most probably we've always questioned everything the science told us. Yeah. And I think we've always looked outside the envelope for a better way to do it. So my dad was the first with Keyline and ploughing on the contour.
Wow, he was ahead of the game.
The pasture improvement and phosphate changed this country from desolate, overgrazed, and he went to a 4-paddock or 2-paddock rest rotation, winter paddock, summer paddock.
Okay.
So even back then, he was looking for ways to get multi-species to grow and not have bare dirt everywhere, which was fundamentally what this country looked like.
And it amazes me, just digressing for a second with the Keyline story, that many aren't aware that Yeoman's concepts were actually national policy for 16 years. They were CSIRO policy, and we didn't drop them because they didn't work. And if they were important then, this concept of every drop of water you can possibly utilise on the farm, you capture it. Well, if they were important then, they're more important now. And it's amazing we don't re-adopt that approach because it's certainly valid.
It is, and this paddock here, we actually grew soybeans way back when we first met you, Graeme. I don't know whether you remember, we were doing leaf sap tests together. So
that's right.
It was really interesting to see us actually working together when you first started, literally.
Yeah, right, back at the start.
And all this country is actually ploughed and contoured on the Keyline.
Yeah,
so
great.
even that's still working. So the big contour banks that we drove over, we've made them a bit smaller, run the water to the hillside.
Fantastic.
So, so we could go into a bit more history, but it's whether you want to get into some of the deeper questions.
Yeah. Oh, we'll continue on. So we've got the basic. So your personal history, that was your parents' history. You were an engineer, and you decided to take a holiday overseas and then sort of redecide your future after you finished with the engineering thing, and sort of decided to come back to the family farm, basically. Is that how it worked?
Yes, very much so, Graeme. And I think when I was a child, I loved living on the land. It was just so much fun. I remember spraying blackberries, working long hours with Dad, helping with sheep, drenching and all of that. And I can't say it was enjoyable, that side of it.
Yeah.
But when we came back to the farm, I was very gracious that my wife, Marie, was off a farm, and she understood better than I did that to live on the land is a privilege
Yeah.
and something that is so important for our own health of family and well-being. So the first 2 years, I had it easy.
Yeah.
And we then went straight into a very dry period for many years.
So you had the hard time quite early on. But
Very early on. But
Yeah.
that was the best thing that happened, because we then suddenly realised I had to learn very quickly. That's when I did the RCS course, Holistic Resource Management. So I was looking, instead of burying my head in the sand saying we're going to keep doing the same things, we looked outside the box. We started to understand through the HRM model, Holistic Resource Management, that you've got to look very wide and understand all these aspects of, it's not just a farm where you just do this every day and think it's going to stay the same.
Yeah.
So that's when we really started to look at risk strategies. How could we do things better, not get caught with prices? We then ran into Graeme McNally, who ran Kialla Foods.
That's right.
And
Graeme,
that was a fantastic journey, because he then gave us the opportunity to manage our price for the cattle. And he said, why don't you convert into organics? And I said, well, I'm happy to do it if you pay me more money. So it was a financial decision. It wasn't about wanting to be organic and, look at me, I'm doing everything. It was because we were going broke.
Yeah.
We had no choice.
So you remain organically certified today?
Yes, so we've been over 30 plus years certified organic.
Good.
And do I agree that everything in the organic system is good? No, but it's again a system that's encouraged us to keep looking for better ways to manage what we do.
That's really good.
So that brings us to pretty much now, where we now have been doing work with looking at our ecology and how maybe down the track we can get paid for that. And we've got a carbon project. This bit of ground here is under a carbon project.
Okay.
So we've constantly always looked for the next opportunity and a way to manage that risk from dry seasons. We built 2 solar farms early on.
Yeah.
That's the best enterprise on the property.
Okay.
So it's drought resistance because it generates more on the dry time than in the wet time. So we've always looked at how we could find another way to financially stabilise a very tough game.
Yes, which is necessary because it's the toughest of all games.
It is.
I've got the 2 farms and I've got quite a large company. We're in quite a few countries now. The farms are about 4 times harder to run than the company. I mean, really, to be profitable. Because you can do everything perfect and then nature comes along and gives you a big kick in the arse. And it's challenging, but I won't give it up. So could you give us some insight into the reality of choosing farming as a profession? As I mentioned, it's the hardest profession I know of. How can you sort of consistently increase profitability, or how can you buffer the bad years? Can you give us some ideas? We've sort of mentioned a couple of them already. You've got to have some multiple income streams, and the solar is part of it, but what other sorts of things do you do?
Yeah, so I think that's really important, and it's establishing those agreements with basically your next person up the chain. And you guys do that by valuating your products and trying to take it straight from paddock to plate, which is the ultimate way to do it. But you've got to watch your margins really carefully and saying, well, what am I good at? And is there someone else who can do it better than me? So we had a go at doing paddock to plate way back, where we had a business in Brisbane where we were actually selling meat into restaurants.
Okay.
And nearly sent us broke because they would never pay us. So we worked out we're better off going to the next level, which is finding people who can finish cattle, because this country, and we'll talk about that more, fitting your enterprise to your climate, your soil, what this area can actually produce, what this property can do. So that's really, really important to understand that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the sort of thing we're always looking at, is how can we make sure we're managing those risks.
Yeah, it's very business-like and quite entrepreneurial, but you weren't a businessman. You were an engineer.
No.
So it just sort of came to you that's how that worked.
Yeah, well, if people think RCS teaches you about cell grazing and managing cattle, they don't.
Okay.
The first thing they teach you is finances and business. Because most people, there's no point doing all this unless you understand how to run a business.
Yeah.
So that was a fundamental core for RCS, and I give them full marks because
I've not ever done that course.
no, well, Terry worked that out, that he was seeing so many farmers going broke when they were just making bad financial decisions, but they were very good at managing land, managing cattle, managing crops.
Yeah.
So this is the key thing that I would promote, and even the young manager we've got on, teaching them about how to do gross margins, how to work out whether a trade's a good trade or not a good trade.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hugely important.
It's absolutely fundamental.
I mean, what I see in it really, I find it as almost a tragedy that, I consider food production to be the single most important profession on the planet, and yet so many farmers have to have an off-farm job to allow them the luxury to produce our food, and there's something horribly wrong about that. And that sort of comes back to your question of, can we be green if we're in the red? And this whole story of how do we build profitability?
Yeah, and I think that's something you've got to ask yourself all the time. How can we've got to treat this as a bit of a game and understand the game.
Yeah.
So what's the big game? So if we look at fundamentally your farm and my farm and Claudia's farm, we have this very expensive shed, incredibly expensive shed, and we're trying to produce something from that shed. Now in the city, you have a shed that you lease or buy. It's not that expensive. And from everything that comes in, everything you manufacture and everything you put out is very systematically controlled. That can never work when you're dealing with nature and landscapes, and it should never be considered that way. But that's a model we have right here in Australia now, and we've got to remember that. So the model is the land cannot be included in the cost of production. But how do we get the land?
Yeah.
So that's where I see there's two games you can play.
Yeah.
And so one is to understand that we have a real estate asset, which is very, very expensive. No relationship now to production. So when my parents bought this property, the amount they paid was valued at the amount of wool you could generate over 15 years and have no debt.
Yeah, like any business. It's just
any business.
Is the value of the business,
But you look at any property in this district, and now even out west, and you do the sums, none of them can even pay the interest now. There's not a property around here you could buy where you could pay the interest from what you can run or produce off it.
Completely wrong, isn't it?
So the model we have is out of control, and we've got to work out how to make this work. So I think, this is where this talk is going to be so good. So we need to think about that really carefully. So there's two ways you can play this. And I'm most probably jumping ahead a few questions.
That's okay.
But I think it's really important to understand what you see with the lifestyle that Marie and I have is not from the farm. It's from understanding the value of the land and how people outside land will allow you to play the game of land speculation. So we could borrow against the value of this land. Now, what's the value of the land? Because we make no profit. So you're going, it should be zero. Yeah. Fundamentally, shouldn't it?
Yeah,
but the banks go, wow, you've got all that land and someone said it's worth X amount. Yeah. We don't know who the someone is because it should be based on productive value. So the banks will say, well, we'll lend you all this money. So you go and buy houses all through the cities or buy other businesses. And then you wait till it goes up, understand your cycles, and you sell them.
And that's what you've done.
And that's what we've done. So to do that, we've cleared all our debt.
Yeah.
And we have money in the bank, which then supports the lifestyle and allows us then to allow the children to come on the property. And Marie and I hopefully have sufficient savings that we can step away from it and allow them to be the next. And I'll use the word custodians because I think we've got to change the concept of farmers. Because when we think of a farmer, what do we think about? We think about producing food and fibre.
Yeah.
But what are we actually managing? A really complex ecosystem.
Yeah.
Really complex. You look at these trees. So the first thing I'd say to you, where's the regrowth? There's none. So have we managed this well? No. So we need to fence this whole ridgeline off, allow the regrowth to come, because when the regrowth comes, what happens? We'll have more birds or more insects, which will stop what's eating your pastures and all that sort of stuff. So we need to move out of the red into that green and have this whole concept that we get paid for managing the environment. And we get paid for producing clean green food. And that's the big challenge I think we have, Graeme, is to change this mentality and to get people to think of the land differently and to get the public who are buying the food and screaming at farmers that are doing a terrible job to understand that someone has to support that to happen.
Yeah.
And that's the big challenge. We're very close.
And how do you think you turn that around? I mean, how do you turn that model around? I mean, you mentioned a couple of people, and I researched them in terms of their concept of land as speculation or land as productivity. But you've used your land as speculation.
Yeah.
You've done the opposite yourself. And are you suggesting that other farmers should probably do the same thing?
Well, I can tell you now that the farmers who have no debt either had a generational farm, but the farmers who've done very well have land speculated.
Yeah.
And I can give you some figures. So there's a benchmarking group. I was involved in benchmarking in RCS for many years. The best we ever did, return on assets, not the actual capital value of your property, but what it took to produce something. Well, the best we ever did was about 2.5%.
Yeah.
The worst we did was constantly round about zero.
Yeah.
Now, we were one of the better in the group. Now, there's another group who's doing that. The guy has no debt on his properties because he's played the off-farm borrowing against his property to buy just shares, letting him and bringing that back and clearing his debt.
Yeah.
And he's a third-generation farmer. So he bought the family farm and bought other farms. And he gets, the best he's ever done is 3.8%. In his group, which these are very switch-on farmers, around about zero. And anyone who's growing oats to finish cattle like this is now negative.
Yeah.
Because the cost of production is too high. So that's a challenge. This is the challenge we've faced. So these guys are surviving by understanding they've got to bring income from somewhere. So they work on the farm, but they know how to play that game.
Yeah.
But if they don't know the cycles, that's when you get hurt.
Yes, because that was the other that you suggested in our research. And he's the guy that's come up with the 18-year cycle.
Yeah.
And how far back has it gone? I mean, it was 2008, so he picked that was 18 years ago. And of course, for those watching, if there's any validity, and there may well be, to this 18-year cycle, which is driven by speculation, according to him. But if there's any validity to that 18-year cycle, well, this is the year. This is the 18 years since 2008. And so theoretically, we could see another disturbance. And if you go back the 18 years before that, it was the previous crash. And the 18 years before that, and I don't know how much further it goes back, but it's fairly impressive.
So it goes back to where it started.
Yeah.
So it goes back to America. That's where it started.
Okay.
So if you look up Henry George's work, he's the one who saw it happening. He was this very clever politician. And he saw what was happening, that as they moved out in the territories and saw this, it created this cycle. But you've got to remember, this cycle is nearly a consciousness of our brain that's affected by, I don't know what, But the cycle also ties to planetary alignments. It also ties to the sunspot activity, which is that 7-year, about a 14-year cycle, to how it affects economics on this planet. And it seems just, this is ridiculous stuff. But you start researching Gann's work. So Gann was the best commodity and share trader ever in history. And it wasn't about the money. He wasn't interested in money. He wanted to understand what drove these markets, what drove commodities up and down. And he said, well, weather definitely will. So it drives our market up and down. So we have a couple of land cycles in agriculture. So we have a weather-driven land cycle, which will be driven by, and this is, people got to do a lot of research here, it is driven by the alignment of planets. Yeah. Now, Inigo Jones discovered that. And if you think about it, it's not illogical science. If all the planets are on one side of the sun and the Earth's on the other side, the effect of the planets on the Earth is changed. If they're now between the sun and the Earth, say in their orbits, then it will affect the Earth differently. Yeah, so Inigo Jones found, if you line this up with a star called the Vega star, that you could predict a drier period in history and a wetter period.
And he's been pretty accurate.
It's been very accurate. Yeah. So you can take that down even further. And if you really understand this, there's people out there who are predicting it down to, they nearly will say to a farmer, don't plant, you're not going to get enough rain to get a crop in. And they're spot on.
And you don't think that the sort of there's an increased uncertainty because of the extremes associated with climate change that's one of the things, like the Weather Bureau getting it wrong a couple of years back when they said the drought was coming, everyone sold their sheep and the drought didn't come. I mean,
and the guy who studies this in Australia, who took Inigo Jones' work and took Gann's work and has studied it in depth, he gave the rain date when it would rain in Stanthorpe.
Yeah, and he got it right.
He was spot on, to the day.
Well,
now, none of this can be done with computers because we're dealing with an intuitive science.
Yeah.
We're dealing with elliptical circles, which is very hard for a computer to work out the direct relationship because it's always changing slightly. It's not exact science. So this is where it takes a lot of skill and a lot of work to get that knowledge that this guy has, who lives on the Sunshine Coast.
Okay, what's his name?
David Burton, and he goes under the alias of Inigo Jones.
Oh, that's the new replacement for Indigo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he does teach us work, but he doesn't give away many secrets.
Yeah.
So don't get me wrong, he's a brilliant guy.
Yeah.
But he says, here's the basics, you've got to learn it.
Yeah.
And I can see why he says that, because he understands that it is intuitive.
Yeah.
But when you start reading some of the books on astrology and all of that, it's just fascinating. You know, there was people in England that the royals would ring up and saying, oh, we've got a party, what's the weather going to be? And they say, oh, it'll be showers in the morning, it'll be fine midday, and then there'll be a gale in the afternoon. And they were spot on.
Yeah.
And that was doing it by hand.
You're suggesting in terms of even risk management that you can use that understanding, that cyclical understanding, to decide when you're going to do, when you're going to sell, when you're going to buy.